Okay, for the rest of tonight, we'll talk about more Indian religious movements now that we've set up the kind of political history. All right. Basically, especially in the middle of the Persian invasions in the 500s, you get an explosion of new religious ideas within India. So you get several new religions popping up, which is a pretty common occurrence in times of real social strife and people worried about survival. You get all kinds of new questions being asked about people's relationship with, other people or with government or with the gods. So there's a lot of debate, and that often leads to newly emerging ideas about morality and responsibility and whatnot. So we saw, just to go through the ideas of reincarnation again real quick, the samsara is the spiritual core. That's the kind of essence of your kind of life energy that survives the death of the body and goes on to be reincarnated into other bodies, and that goes on life after life after life. Dharma is the fulfillment of your duties according to which group and society you were born into. And karma is the kind of spiritual weight that you carry from one life to another, depending on if you were a good moral person, if you did the jobs you were supposed to do in your previous life. So the actions you take in this life helps determine what group you get born into in your next life. Does that make sense? So we've gone over all these before when we talked about India before. And just at the point where the Persians start invading in the 500s and conquering chunks of northern India, again, you start seeing the rise of new religious movements. So the reincarnation worship type of religion, the old Vedic religion, is still around and it's dominant, but new competitors come on the scene that will start looking for converts, basically. And the first of these to talk about is called Jainism. Jainism retains a lot of the Vedic kind of religion, mostly the focus on having some kind of spiritual core in your being. But one thing that the Jains do is they extend that to all forms of life. So all animals also have souls, basically. And plants also. They all have this spiritual essence. So the Jains look at all living things as equal, that humans are not better or different. Well, they're different physically, but they're not any better than the animal or plant world. And the Jains say that you should have reverence for all these different kinds of life that we're surrounded by. And that killing a lot of animals is, morally reprehensible and should be avoided. And also killing a lot of plants is a bad thing. So their idea is that if you have reverence for all this life, you be a non-violent person as much as you possibly can, then you can purify your own self, your own kind of spirit. And that purity they call moksha. You kind of reach a higher plane of existence if you are a good moral person. You're not going around destroying things and killing for your own greedy purposes. And one of the big keys to this, they say that people who achieve moksha, who achieve this purity, they get out of being reincarnated. They escape. They don't have to live again and again and again. It's an escape hatch, basically. Because, at least by this point, a lot of Indians are looking at reincarnation as really not a good thing, because life is full of pain and misery and work and suffering. not just physically, but you grow up and you watch people you care about leave, or they die, or something bad happens to them. So they say life is surrounded with pain and suffering all the time, and they don't want to have to live again and again and again and again for eternity and have to go through that over and over and over again. So escaping reincarnation for a lot of people becomes a big goal. They don't want to have to live that painful life over and over again. So a lot of people in India start hearing about Jainism, and they start converting to it in order to escape reincarnation. So that at some point when they achieve that spiritual purity and their body dies, then the spirit doesn't have to go into another body. It kind of goes off and becomes one with the eternal universe. Does it make sense? So this is a very attractive idea for a lot of Indians. It's also a big problem for a lot of them, because a lot of them are farmers. And what do farmers do virtually every day?
Killing?
Yeah, they kill. They kill plants in harvesting, or they kill animals. So for a lot of the average workers in society, most ancient societies are overwhelmingly farmers. A whole lot of them, they might want to get to that point, but just their daily actions will prevent them from achieving that purity. Does that make sense? Just their daily job.
So it's still almost like a caste.
Yeah.
Because if you're stuck in those jobs, you don't have the option to do that.
Yeah. But even if you're born into the upper class, if you're still, eating meat and a lot of vegetables and whatnot, you're contributing to the system of death and destruction, right? So a lot of people get kind of hopeful with Jainism, but it's seen as not something that they have access to. Does that make sense? To achieve that level of purity, you might have to starve to death. But it's at least possible, whereas with the old Vedic religion, it's just reincarnation. There's no way out. So a lot of people start converting to it and trying to figure out how to make this work with real daily life that people have to pursue just in order to survive. Are there questions about Jainism at all? Nope.
What do they eat? Nothing.
Well, eventually they developed this idea that you can achieve the purity by basically becoming vegetarian, not eating animals so much at all, and eating as little plants as possible. So it's trying to reduce your consumption to the point where you can achieve the purity, which means with a lot of meditation and a lot of very religious kind of holy people just don't eat a whole lot to begin with, right? They fast. Does it make sense? So it all gets kind of wrapped up around that. These ideas all get kind of melded together. But they'll soften it eventually to make it more possible, therefore more socially acceptable to follow the movement. Moving on? Oh, okay. Let's see. And the big one that starts growing by leaps and bounds at this point in the 500 it becomes known as Buddhism. Buddhism grows out of the life story of a guy who's a prince in one of these kingdoms in northern India that are kind of fighting amongst each other and trying to fight off the Persians at the same time. So he is the heir to the throne of one of these kingdoms, and he is raised in a life of luxury to the point where he never has any idea about pain or suffering. He's kept in the palace. And when he starts to learn about these things, as a guy in his 20s, the whole world that he knew kind of explodes in his mind, and he has to confront these big human conundrums. And the choices he makes puts him on a path of seeking enlightenment and giving up his throne. And I have another video that'll explain that in much greater detail than I possibly could. So he leaves the palace and he never goes back. And he goes off and spends years looking for someone to teach him a method of meditation or something to come to understand how to escape pain and suffering. And he follows one teacher after another for reportedly 10 years and tries all these different gurus and ideas and philosophies, and finds them all lacking. None of them worked. And the story goes that he eventually decided to sit underneath a tree and meditate, and made a deal with himself that he'll either come to a solution for pain and suffering, and he won't get up until he does so. And he reportedly meditates for like 3 days, and finally comes to what he later describes as the answer. And his answer is what he called the Four Noble Truths, and one follows the other. So, number one, life consists of pain and suffering. That's one of the fundamental things about life, and it doesn't matter how rich or how poor. We all lose friends and family members. We all have traumatic experiences. So pain and suffering is inescapable, and that all people experience it. And he says, for poor people, the suffering is pretty obvious. They might not have enough to eat. They might have some kind of disease they can't find a remedy for. They might not have a house or a place to live. Their suffering is pretty obvious. But rich people also suffer. And his description of that is, everybody gets old and dies if you're fortunate enough to live to old age. So even rich people have family members that have grown old and died, and so they have experienced loss also. So he says, no matter who you are, no matter what your place is in the world, where you are, or how rich or how poor or how powerful or anything, you will experience pain and suffering. It's inescapable. So he says, number two, you have to figure out why you're feeling this pain and suffering. And he says, when you think about if you have enough to eat and all the kind of basics of life, your suffering is mostly emotional, based on loss, losing friends or your favorite pet or family members or whoever. And that the loss itself doesn't cause the suffering, it's your reaction to the loss, that it's your desire to keep talking with those people that have died. It's your desire to keep having things in your life that has gone. Does that make sense? So he says the solution for that is to eliminate your desire. If people are inevitably going to leave your life, the best way to deal with that is to not indulge in the desire to have them back. Does that make sense? To overcome that. And he proposes a bunch of ways of doing that. In number 4, you can get rid of your desires by a series of steps that he calls righteous living. Meditation is part of it. Being a moral person, having good judgment, having consciousness for those around you. Those are all steps in this righteous living. Does that make sense? And he says if you continue focusing on those, then you will basically enjoy life on a daily basis, and you'll enjoy the people that are around, and you won't pine for the people that leave, and you won't live life based in a fear of when they will leave. Is that clear? So you'll enjoy life as it is and not worry about the past or the future too much. Is that good with that? All right. And I remember when I first started thinking about this, I remember at a Thanksgiving dinner where a bunch of family are around. I remember one time thinking, when I was one of the younger people at the table, I've since been bypassed in that. I remember looking at the family members and saying, well, one of us is going to be the last one at this table, right? One of us is going to outlive everybody else, and is going to have to bury all those other people and go to all those funerals and experience that. Does that make sense? So I was already kind of thinking along those lines, and just thinking about that for a while. And Siddhartha Gautama, who eventually becomes known as the Buddha, says that that's a wrong way to think. You should enjoy the dinner and enjoy the company and not worry about the future. Worry about the loss that you will experience at some point in the future. Just enjoy life as it comes day after day. To kind of live in the moment. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is his system for avoiding pain and suffering. And it's all, he says, basically the pain is in your own mind. And if you can train your mind to avoid that desire, then you can avoid the pain. He says once you get to that point, you have reached an enlightened state. So he becomes known as the Buddha, which translates basically as the enlightened one. He gets these ideas around age 40 or so, and then he starts traveling around, talking to people, trying to convince other people of these ideas and spread the ideas far and wide as possible. Does that make sense? Questions about him or his ideas at all?
Did he ever go back?
No. According to the story, the legend, no, he never went back to the palace. Never went back to his former life. Spent the rest of his days kind of wandering the countryside and talking to people and taking gifts of food and shelter and whatnot.
And did his former family and people, did they hear about what became of him?
Well, they hear about this guy that's wandering around. They don't know if that's him, though. But they never make contact with him again, according to the legend. Yeah, so he leaves that night and never goes back, and they can never track him down. Yeah. That could also just be the legend, because that former life is based in desire, right? So if you're going to have a statement of getting rid of desire, you have to have a radical break. Other questions? A lot of legends that get passed down might not always be perfectly accurate to exactly what happened. But the problem is, if you don't find evidence to prove that the legend is wrong, then it just keeps going. Let's see. All right. So you have two kind of emergent religions. The Jains are starting to promise the idea of escaping reincarnation, and eventually Buddhism starts to grow to the point where they start saying if you become that enlightened, you can also escape reincarnation. So there's two new religious movements in India that are making big promises about a goal that a lot of people want to achieve, escaping reincarnation. They don't want to have to live over and over again because of all the pain and suffering involved in life. And many historians argue that at this point the Vedic religion is shrinking. The normal kind of old style religion in India at this point, they're losing members because so many people are converting to Jainism and Buddhism. So in order to survive this, historians argue that the Vedic leaders start altering their own religious beliefs in order to keep their followers, to keep their, I guess in Christianity you would call it congregations. So they also start making it theoretically easier to get reincarnated to higher and higher levels. Oops. There we go. And their kind of altering of the Vedic religion eventually leads to what we today call Hinduism, which is still based in the caste, where you're born, what level of society, and the duties that you have as a result of where you're born into. But they say that your fulfillment of those jobs in your life brings such a peace to your spirit that you get reincarnated up to a higher level. And once you get up to the highest level of humanity, like the leaders of governments and the most powerful groups, if you live a good moral life and you do good work at that point, you can achieve such a spiritual purity that you get escaped out of reincarnation. You don't have to live another life. So when you get to the highest levels and you're still good, then when you die in that life, your spirit can basically go off and join the eternal, and you don't have to be reincarnated anymore. Does that make sense? So Hinduism eventually provides the escape hatch, the eternal peace. And many historians argue they do it because you have these other alternative religions now that are offering it. And if you don't offer it also, people are going to walk away from you. It's kind of market competition for customers in religion. And some scholars have argued that, well, they don't explicitly say that you can escape reincarnation, so maybe you just get to the highest level of society, you're still being reincarnated, but you've achieved such a spiritual purity that your life isn't really full of pain and suffering anymore. So there's some argument there.
When does like the cow become sacred to them? You know,
That's part of the Vedic religion. It becomes a major part of Hinduism also.
And why is it sacred? I mean,
It's the giver of milk, which they see as the giver of life. Yeah. So, yeah, if you go to India and try to eat a hamburger, you'll get different meat because they refuse to eat cows or any derivative of cow, really. Anything that would lead to the cow's death. And Hinduism, or the Vedic religion, already had many, many gods, and hundreds of them. And as it evolves into Hinduism in the 500s and 400s, they start emphasizing some certain gods as like more powerful than others or more important to the general world, your general life. So Brahman becomes known as the creator of everything. And Shiva is kind of the opposite of that, the destroyer, a kind of negative force in the universe. And another one is called Vishnu, which is seen as the protector of humans and of life in general. But there are hundreds and hundreds of different gods. And eventually Hinduism a lot of Hindu followers will kind of develop a personal relationship or view one god as really important for their own lives for one reason or another. Often what they're trying to do in that life. They'll go to the god that protects whatever job they're trying to do, or if they're trying to travel or something like that. And Hinduism will venerate cows, and will also venerate the Ganges River, which becomes seen as a place for personal purification. So you have a lot of pilgrimages of average people, average workers in Indian society. They go to the Ganges River every once in a while, and they wash themselves in the river as a purification ritual. And kings do this. And, as the video we saw last time, the guy talked about how the kings often go to the Ganges River and give great gifts to charity. And you still see this going on even today. India is today a democracy. They don't have kings anymore. But these are modern pictures, so some of these rituals last a long, long, long time. So by the 400s, you have three different major religions in India: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And by the time the Kushans come into place, they invade down from modern-day Afghanistan, down from beyond the mountains. They take over India, and we saw this slide at the end of last time. They connect India to the Silk Road, this kind of inter-civilizational trade route that goes from one place to another. But especially one of the emperors, named Kanishka, converts to Buddhism himself and sees Buddhism as like the great solution for all human suffering and all pain in the world. So he specifically sends Buddhist missionaries from India, where Buddhism starts, and they go to the Silk Road and they travel along it, especially going eastward toward China, at government expense. So Kanishka gives the Buddhist missionaries government money, tax revenue, to go off to other places in the world and build Buddhist missions, basically, and try to convert other humans all over the place. And it's most successful in East Asia. So Buddhism will enter, say, China with big government support from India. The Buddhists don't just go do it themselves, and that government support helps a lot because it's finance, it's money. So they can buy land, they can build buildings and build communities and congregations. So Buddhism starts to grow very quickly, especially around China, and then will often spread further south into what on this map is called Southeast Asia. Does that make sense? Yeah. Moving on from here? Yeah. All right. And this starts a big controversy. The original Buddha was alive in the 500s. Just like everyone else, he got old and died. And as generations go and hundreds of years start to pass, other leaders in Buddhism who studied these ideas and meditated and claimed to be right on the cusp of their full-scale enlightenment, what they call nirvana. These Buddhas, they start being known as Buddhas, other enlightened ones, basically. They are moving around and trying to grow the religion and gain converts and spread the message, spread the idea. And many of them make the decision to stop their own personal process, so they don't achieve the full level of enlightenment. They do not achieve escape from reincarnation, so that they can be reincarnated and come back in another life and talk to more people. Does that make sense? So the more lives that they live, the more people they can contact and grow the idea even faster. So they make a decision to sacrifice their own escape from reincarnation. They choose, they say, to live again and again and again and deal with all that pain and suffering so that they can convert more people, spread the message further. So there's a big self-sacrifice involved in this. They start calling it, or it starts to be called, the Mahayana, which translates to the greater vehicle. It's greater because they're going to reach more people because they're living more times. Does that make sense? So they're just going to increase the numbers. They're going to scale it up. And because they're sacrificing the achievement of their great goal in order to serve humankind over and over and over again, a lot of them start become like respected, almost like saints in Christianity. People who do great things at great personal cost for the good of others. Does that make sense? And the Mahayanan version becomes mostly powerful in China and Japan and Korea. So far East Asia. But the other Buddhists, basically the traditionalists, have a big complaint about this. They say that, well, the individual Buddhas, they can, make their own choices. But the problem with respecting these guys as kind of saints is that will lead followers to worship the person instead of the idea. They'll venerate the person instead of thinking about the idea, which can be dangerous because they'll just kind of worship icons and images and stories instead of meditating themselves and trying to curb their own desires. Does that make sense? Which is actually really a whole lot easier to do. It's much easier to, say, have a picture of somebody and light a candle in front of them and say, okay, I've done my religious duty for the day, and then that's it. It's much easier and less time consuming to do that than to have to sit down and meditate and think for 2 to 3 hours. Does that make sense? It's just less demanding. It's easier to worship icons. And the traditionalist Buddhists say that we shouldn't be respecting individuals. Individuals are not important. The messengers are not important. The message is what's important. The idea. Is that clear? So their message is, forget about these individual Buddhas and all their personal decisions and whatnot. You should be focused on pushing yourself to enlightenment. And they become made fun of. The Mahayana followers call them, the traditionalists, the Theravada, because they're lesser vehicle. The messengers of Theravada, they're going to achieve their nirvana and they're going to escape reincarnation, so they're not going to live over and over again, so they're going to reach less people. So derisively, as an insult, they're called the Theravada version of Buddhism. But they're basically the traditionalists who say, we're following the original message from the original Buddha. Does that make sense? All right. And it's just much more difficult because it's time consuming. It takes time to meditate and reflect on your own life and to figure out how to curb desire. So for an average worker, farming's not an easy job. For an average farmer has to work 12, 14 hours a day. Or for people that who have 2 jobs or a full-time job and a part-time job, it's just so much work that you just might not have enough hours in the day to do this on a daily basis. So it's easier just to go home and burn a candle in front of an image at night while you're eating dinner. Does that make sense? So many large populations, especially in cities, often transfer to the Mahayana version because it's just easier for them to do in their own daily lives with all their pressures of family and work and responsibilities and whatnot. So, questions about those? No?
Is there any fights between them?
Well, there's arguments, but Buddhists are almost completely nonviolent. So they usually don't physically fight each other. They don't start wars. They reject war completely. And when they complain about wars, they'll often go to emperors and whatnot and demand an end to the wars, and often they're massacred. And that still happens even today. They just refuse to fight, even in their own self-defense.
Wasn't there like the famous picture of those Buddhists that lit themselves on fire just to protest
Yeah.
some war?
Yeah, that was during the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, where they were bombing. The Theravada version, go back to the map for a second. The Theravada version largely gets popular and has a foothold in kind of Southeast Asia, which is right where Vietnam is still today. Vietnam is kind of along this edge here, the eastern edge of Southeast Asia. And a lot of Buddhist monks, to complain about the mass slaughter that the Americans were inflicting on Vietnam, what's called self-immolation. They burned themselves alive. They doused themselves with gasoline and set themselves on fire. And that was a well-known thing during that war and was broadcast to the United States. So that's a high level of an anti-war dedication. And some people still continue doing that, even in places that are not even Buddhist, because it's such a giant public statement. Right? That's where the Arab Spring started in 2010. A guy who felt so angry about his own government that he went to a public area and set himself on fire and complained and died. And that inspired revolutions across many countries. So yeah. Other questions?
Is there anything in like the Buddhist teachings that allow you to like kill yourself?
I don't. Well, there's several strands of it now. I mean, Buddhism's been around for 2,500 years. There's a lot of different interpretations of it, and different movements of it, and it's hugely complex. I mean, this is extremely simplified. And I'm not a scholar on Buddhism in the least, so I don't even know enough about any of those strands to even answer that. So, but historians always say, one of the jokes amongst history teachers, if a student asks you a question you don't have an answer for, you tell them, that's a really good topic for a term paper. Basically, why don't you do the research and tell me? But I'm sure there's been books and articles and all kinds of arguments written on that exact question. I haven't kept up with it, so I don't know. I don't know the answer. Or if there even is an answer. So, yeah. Anything else? Moving on from here? Good? All right. All right. So Buddhism is undergoing these kind of internal debates and alterations and evolutions. Hinduism is also kind of evolving in order to keep up with the changes within Buddhism. And one of the things that they do is really when the Buddhists start arguing against each other, that kind of opens a door for Hinduism to grow its own popularity. Basically, a lot of Buddhists get so exasperated at the argument within Buddhism, or the many arguments within Buddhism, that many people start to return to what is by then becoming Hinduism. And one of the big things that the Hindu leaders start to advocate in order to bring these former Buddhists back into their own movement is to make the original Buddha into one of the lives of Vishnu, who was one of the big protector gods of humanity. So they say that the original Buddha, his life, was actually Vishnu's spirit in human form. Does that make sense? Which kind of reconnects the original Buddha and his message to overall Hinduism, makes him like one part, one story within Hinduism. And probably to get people to convert back to Hinduism, to open this door to make it popular again. And all kinds of stories start to spread about the original Buddha, beyond anything kind of based in the real world. So you get one of the more popular stories is that right when Siddhartha was born, he's born, he pops out of his mom, and he immediately stands up, like this newborn baby stands up and starts walking around saying, I am to be the Buddha and I'm going to be the savior of humanity. And every step he took on the ground, lotuses start to grow. So that's a legend that probably did not happen. But you get these kind of legends within religious movements, right? People walking on water or curing diseases or doing all kinds of like extraordinary things. And even in this piece of art, this is supposed to be the Buddha actually walking on water. So you hear these stories kinds of getting recycled over and over again, these popular myths. Does it make sense? So even the story of the Buddha, which seemed kind of rooted in a real life story of a human, of a real person, is getting kind of like manipulated over time. And the Hindus want to make it easier for people to come back into Hinduism, so they start softening the caste duties, the hardcore jobs that each group in society was supposed to perform, starts making it easier to kind of negotiate within those borders and do different kinds of work. They start saying that, especially if you're in the rich class, that you can be rich and enjoy the wealthy lifestyle without building up so much negative karma that you'll be reincarnated down into the working class. So that you don't have to give away all your money and live a completely poor, impoverished life in order to build up enough spiritual kind of purity to get reincarnated up a level. you can actually enjoy having material goods and having a lot of food. Does that make sense? So it makes it easier for people to stick with Hinduism. And Hinduism starts talking to its followers about you should pick out one of the gods and try to develop a personal relationship with one of those gods, which makes it easier to follow religion if you're focused on one instead of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Is that clear?
The gods have like shrines or like monuments.
Oh yeah, they're all over the place in India and in other places in the world. Yeah, absolutely. And some of them are extremely old. I mean, thousands of years old. So, people that want to travel from one city to another, they'll look to the god of protection for travelers or something and give dedications to that god. Or if you want to have a family, and gods of fertility. And it just depends on what you're trying to do in life. Alrighty. And a lot of Hinduism is still run by governments. Governments kind of take over the shrines in their territories. And there's a melding of kind of Hindu religious leaders with government leaders over time. So just like the old Vedic religion where Hinduism kind of has its roots, a lot of tenets of Hinduism show how generally an elite class, a conquering class, can use religion to keep people calm and to stop them, or at least try to encourage them to not revolt. To just go through life, and even if you have complaints, don't start uprisings or anything. One useful way is just to have people worship inanimate objects, like pictures or shrines or tokens or whatever it is. Because it's much easier to ask the shrine for something than it is to go to the government and make demands. Also, that you're supposed to have this personal relationship with the deity, because that can often isolate people, keep them in their own homes rather than gathering large groups together, because governments often don't like large groups getting together, because then they start to recognize their own power and they start to talk to each other and they might start organizing some kind of resistance movement. So governments are often interested in keeping people separated in their own homes and just living their own private lives. Many governments fear the masses getting together. And governments have feared those things for a long, long time. And the government also tells people just live a nice, calm life, and after you die, you'll be rewarded, which is pretty difficult to prove. And many philosophers have written about all kinds of different religions that make those promises, saying this faith in an unprovable reward is a method of social control. It keeps people calm, stops them from rising up. If you tell them that you'll be punished with being reincarnated down a level, if you rise up against the government, that could keep a lot of people at home. Does that make sense?
Opiate of the masses.
That's what Karl Marx said. Religion is the opiate of the masses, the drug of the masses that keeps them sedated to the point they're willing to put up with all this pain and poverty in their life because they're told if they rise up against government, they're going to hell.